Hi, I'm Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A, where we spend an hour with nonfiction writers and historians who add context to today's news. Economist Jayme Lemke, who's with George Mason University's Mercatus Center, talks about the social and economic disruption caused by the COVID pandemic and the response by the federal government with stimulus programs. She also talks about her research into women's economic history, especially her writing on Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. Our conversation will begin in just a moment. Dr. Jayme Lemke, when public health officials and medical researchers have been looking at the biological questions surrounding the COVID pandemic, economists such as yourself have been studying and observing its economic impact. At a very macro level, what are some of the things that you have been seeing over the past year about the economic impacts of this pandemic?
This pandemic situation has had a pretty significant economic impact in a number of ways. The disease itself, the fact that people are dealing with this new, strange, scary phenomena has caused some changes in economic activity. People want to stay home, so there's a shift in the kind of services that people find most valuable. But of course, the political response has also had a pretty significant economic impact as well. So especially in the early days of the pandemic, March through about July last year, which that's the time period it looks like the National Bureau of Economic Research will wind up declaring to be the official recession period associated with the pandemic. There were many closures of bars and restaurants and small businesses. Of course, the impact on working women in particular and on low-income workers has been disproportionate. So it's going to take some time to work through those issues and figure out how to fully maximize our economic productivity and get back to the level we were before. Because we were coming out of 10 years of straight economic growth. That's pretty incredible. It wasn't going to last forever, but it'd be nice to get back there again.
Given the magnitude of the pandemic and its global effects, are there really any parallels that economists can turn to base current economic projections on? Like, for example, is 2008 a relevant comparison?
I think it's a very relevant comparison. And it was a similar crisis in the sense that that also had a disproportionate impact on low-income workers, although a slightly different segment of the population. But we saw the same kind of dramatic, quick downturn. Fortunately, it looks like we're seeing a quicker recovery this time. But I think learning from the mechanisms that helped us get out of that crisis will be valuable again. And in particular, the important role that markets play in experimenting and adapting to novel circumstances. It's going to be important to focus on the conditions that will allow those processes to happen.
When you've written about the COVID pandemic, one of the terms that you've used is real-time creative destruction. What does that mean in terms of an economy that people can understand?
It's not a perfect metaphor. The term creative destruction comes from Joseph Schumpeter, and the idea is that anytime we are going to really change the way we live and change the way the economy produces, that there are necessarily going to be things that get left by the wayside. So there's always going to be some degree of destruction associated with whatever new is created, because we're changing the way resources are used. And this pandemic is kind of forcing us to engage in that creative process. I think there's some optimism that we can find in that. In particular, with the issue of working women, it's been known for a while that flexibility in work is one of the most useful ways to enable women to balance a profession and motherhood. And now we're all very familiar with Zoom and using online technologies and work from home. So there are some good things long-term that might come out of it. But of course, in the short term, there is some pretty serious, I think it would be fair to say, trauma to be dealt with, in the sense of people who have lost their economic stability, people who have lost their health. And the big political economy question in my mind is, what kind of system will best help those people rebound?
Is it more complicated this time around because of pandemic-related closings of institutions in society, like churches, for example, that would normally help individuals through periods of disruption?
I think that's definitely a complication. Businesses have needed to evolve, and nonprofits have needed to evolve. Our public institutions have needed to. But as you point out, some of those avenues for adaptation have been closed off. And there's been a lot of uncertainty about what will and will not be allowed. So, for example, the mini distilleries that shut down their operations last summer in order to retool and produce hand sanitizer rather than liquor, they wound up being sent bills for $14,000 to be reclassified as medical producers. Those bills came from the FDA. And fortunately, they did the right thing and wound up not requiring those distilleries to pay those fees. But that's exactly the kind of effect that can really chill our ability to retool and figure out how to get through this together. Imagine if they had known ahead of time that their efforts to help their community would wind up coming with a $14,000 price tag. I imagine many of them probably couldn't have been able to afford to perform the service they did. So to the greatest extent possible, minimizing regulatory barriers to trying new things is critically important to getting over that hump of the problem that the way we used to do things is just not going to work, at least for right now.
The displacement of individual workers in the midst of all this. There was an interview program we did on our network just this morning where the number 100,000 businesses have shuttered in the past year. So at the end of that are individuals who worked at those companies. Is it likely, so many people seem to have impediments to finding new careers, location, level of education, family responsibilities. Is it likely that there will be an extended period of less than optimal employment, or a higher level of unemployment is what I should ask?
Certainly the labor market has been slower to rebound than GDP or some other economic measures that we might look at. One of the interesting things to see in this pandemic has been how many people are moving out of cities and into rural areas where they can perform their jobs, but without paying such exorbitant costs of living. For a long time, we've had a problem, and there are zoning laws that wind up exacerbating this problem. Part of it is just the economic opportunity that cities have available. But living in a city where the jobs are is extraordinarily expensive. We've decoupled that a little bit, so that might help overcome some of that displacement. But yes, I think redeveloping skills and restructuring the labor market is a process that's still going to need to play out, which is one of the reasons why I think in the most recent pandemic relief bill, trying to build a $15 minimum wage into that is, from the perspective of economic analysis, just not a good idea. It's not the right time. You already have people, and particularly those people who are lower income, who are working lower wage jobs. They're already having trouble finding work. Making it more expensive for companies to hire those people, particularly the very many small businesses that have been disproportionately affected by the lockdowns, it's not going to help. It's only going to make work harder to find and only going to make it more difficult for those displaced persons.
When you gave the example of the distilleries and the regulations, as you and your colleagues have been looking across the country and the response by state and local governments, has there been a real attempt by regulators to lessen the regulations during this time in order to help local business? I'm sure everyone watching this has examples of restaurants in their communities where you never could have eaten out in the street before, but now there are street-side tents for serving people. Has that been fairly common across the country where regulators are saying, right now we got to roll back some of the regulations in order to let businesses survive this process?
Yes, it has been fairly common. And to the extent that localities and states have done those kind of things, it's been a real blessing. For many businesses, the only thing that would enable them to continue to survive. And that kind of creativity and ability of a business owner to be able to identify the opportunities that are going to work for their customer is one of the reasons why having an overly centrally planned economic policy to deal with this pandemic is not a great idea. It's going to be the businesses who know their neighborhood, who know what kind of services their customers are going to be able to afford and what's going to work for their climate, for their culture. So I think leaving those kind of decisions about how to restructure operations in order to remain safe, which of course is critically important, and I don't want to minimize that, but leaving those decisions kind of with the businesses, with the churches and the other community organizations, it allows them to engage in some of those kind of creative solutions that we've seen. You know, one of my favorite in the early days, from the early days of the pandemic, were the high-end restaurants who would let you add on a side of toilet paper until the supply chains had time to readjust and provide to the residential market again.
A couple of times in your answers, you've already cited the impact on women. And I know that women economic research, female economic research, is a real area of emphasis for you in your studies. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in their January jobs report said that 275,000 women left the workforce just in the prior month, compared with 71,000 men. And overall, nearly 2.4 million women have exited the workforce in the last year. And when you exit the workforce, as you know, for the audience, that means that you're no longer counted in the unemployment numbers because you're not actively seeking work. And we've learned through hearings on Capitol Hill there's a disproportionate impact on particularly women of color. And the sectors most hit the worst are services, retail, and restaurants, which typically employ more women. And of course, women are dealing with more of the brunt of at-home schooling. So with all those thoughts and statistics in mind, can you project at this point how serious this loss of economic power will be for women in this country going forward for the next couple of years?
I think the ultimate long-run impact on women is a real undecided question. Claudia Golden at Harvard has done fantastic research and has a team doing fantastic research on the question of how it is that women can raise children and still have successful careers. So one aspect of this issue is whatever the underlying reason is, and there are many different hypotheses, it still is the reality that when women have children, they undertake more of the caretaking responsibilities than the father does. So this ability to work multiple full-time jobs simultaneously, the job of being a mother and whatever your profession is really difficult if you're locked into the kind of job that has you behind a desk from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and won't let you be there to put your kids on the bus in the morning and doesn't allow that kind of flexibility. So to the extent that the adaptation we're seeing right now leaves companies more open to flexibility, then I would think that would be good. But we've already had this extended period of time where women have been at home, and even if they are equal in income earning to their husband, they are taking on more of the childcare responsibilities, and not in every relationship. And of course, there are relationships where it's the reverse. But I think it remains a serious unanswered question, which of those two effects will dominate? Because there are many professional men who will have gotten ahead on their work in the past year and many professional women who will have fallen behind. And I think if you look at the history of women's involvement in the economy, there has been resistance at every step to viewing women as professional equals. And I think gender norms run deep. They are ancient. And getting past those and really embracing equality for women can be set back by something like this. I'm hopeful, though, that at the end of the day, the flexibility and work effect will dominate. And I think the best chance for that to be the dominant effect will be, again, if we allow the economy to have maximum flexibility in terms of readapting and make sure that we don't overly burden companies that might want to change with regulation that will prevent them from doing so.
You've also written about the intersection for women of economic power and political power. Just even thinking in terms of the 2020 election, are you seeing an impetus for more women to be involved in the political realm, from everything as simple as voting to running for office as a result of the pandemic-related crises?
That's a great question. I think there has been a trend for a long time towards expanding what we imagine women to be capable of. This gets back to that idea of what are our ideas and expectations about what it means to be a woman, to be a man, and how that might limit you. There is a historical effect where even when in times when we thought women didn't have the reason and the composure to work in a profession like law, it took those first few women to enter that occupation and show that they actually were quite competent and successful. And then the chain of change occurs. So we're seeing really different kinds of socialization today than we have in the past. We don't see each other as much. So I think it's a good nudge to try to be even more open-minded about what it is that people might be able to bring to the table when we can't so much see their work. There's been a problem throughout history, the discipline of women's history, and Gerda Lerner is one of my favorite historians on this topic. She founded the subfield in a sense. They have noted for a long time that what happens in the home often gets overlooked in the history books and on the national stage. So hopefully we've learned something from that history, and the technology and the means of communication we have today can help us prevent the same thing from happening again.
So moving from understanding the scope of the problem to some of the debates over remediation that are happening. First of all, of course, as we're talking, Washington is in the midst of a big debate about the second $1.9 trillion COVID relief package. Let's listen to Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen at her January confirmation hearing, talking about the need for a package of this size.
Neither the president-elect nor I proposed this relief package without an appreciation for the country's debt burden. But right now, with interest rates at historic lows, the smartest thing we can do is act big. In the long run, I believe the benefits will far outweigh the costs, especially if we care about helping people who have been struggling for a very long time.
On the other side of the equation, people who are following the debate are seeing economists such as Lawrence Summers, former Treasury Secretary, arguing that the package is too big for the current state of the economy. Help people sort through these very strong opposing opinions on either side of the relief package. What should they think about?
I think it's really hard to even grasp the magnitude of the current public debt held by the United States government. We're at a level of, it's about $80,000 or $85,000 per person. That's every man, woman, and child that the federal government holds in debt that is going to need to be paid at some point. For perspective, that's about twice as much debt as Greece held when they had their pretty epic economic collapse. So we are in quite a dangerous situation in terms of public debt. But another observation that I want to make about her comments is this idea that if we don't take on the public debt, that we somehow are not caring for the people who are most in need right now. And I would argue that it's actually the opposite. So when we undertake public debt, it winds up being having an impact on individuals through either current or future taxation. And this is something that is going to disproportionately affect the low-income people who have already been hurt. And it's taking and redirecting resources away from individuals, from communities, and from the ways that they might want to be using those resources in order to improve their own local situation. So it's not just a matter of the accumulation of debt, although that's a very serious problem. And there are some really fun YouTube videos you can watch to try to get a sense of a scale of trillion that I would recommend. But it really is almost beyond our capacity to imagine for most of us. And undertaking this kind of debt for relief programs that are not even obviously directing resources towards those most in need. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of other policy action mixed into these so-called relief packages. There's money that's going to the military and to all sorts of federal agencies and programs. And it's pretty far from efforts like increasing unemployment insurance that might actually provide some relief to the people who are suffering most in the meantime. And we're mortgaging our future for the sake of these very uncertain policy actions. I would much rather those individuals be able to hang on to those resources and direct them through their own small businesses and their own communities.
You mentioned some of the individual policy debates going on, and I highlighted a couple that I wanted to get your perspective on. You actually referenced one of them, and that's the debate over raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. What are your concerns about that?
My primary concern about raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour is that it will actually accomplish the opposite effect of what is intended by the policy. So I take the goal to be to increase earnings for people who are low-income workers and who are currently taking home the least after the end of the day of work. But what happens in reality is disemployment. So, and this disemployment, when companies and especially small businesses, again, it's easy for us to imagine Amazon paying a $15 minimum wage, and I am not sure what they currently pay and how it relates to $15 per hour. But many of the small businesses and startups that are trying to get off the ground, they simply can't afford it, and they simply won't be able to afford to hire. And one thing we know from history is that this disemployment will have a disproportionate impact on the young. It will have a disproportionate impact on minorities and a disproportionate impact on people who were not able to complete their high school education. So we wind up actually hurting the worst off in society and depriving them of their ability to earn for themselves.
You've also written about COVID-related eviction moratoriums. What is the issue at stake here?
Again, this is one of these policies that sounds on the surface like it should be so helpful to the population that it's intended for. But there's a very serious risk to that population, actually. I already mentioned briefly the housing crisis that we have now in most of the largest American cities, where rent is just near unaffordable. It's exorbitant. And as an economist, the best way to get rent to fall is to increase the supply of housing. Now, if you can't reliably gather rent, then as a landlord, you have no incentive and might not even have the ability to be able to increase the supply of available housing. And unfortunately, we're seeing this outcome come true already, in the sense that many landlords now cannot pay their own mortgages and are now facing the problem of being evicted themselves because their tenants aren't paying. So I think it's a real serious problem for those populations. A much better policy would be to shrink these massive, centrally planned, highly directed COVID relief packages and just provide direct relief to people who do wind up losing housing.
When you describe the impact on the landlords, are you mostly thinking of small and mid-sized landlords as opposed to these large corporations that can go into the debt market and get loans to cover their situations?
Yeah, that's right. And most of the rental market, over half, is these mom and pop landlords, people who own a small number of properties or who maybe rent out their own former dwelling. So it's these individuals that are going to be impacted first. And you're right, it's always the big companies that have the ability to hang on the longest and to be able to continue to operate even if they aren't bringing in good cash flow. But these mom and pops, just like our small businesses, we've seen enormous closure of small business. And this is one of the ways that regulation winds up being a force that centralizes not just political power, but also economic power. Because the big corporations, the big owners of rental property, they're the ones who can afford to comply. It's anybody who might want to enter that market newly and try to compete, or who is operating more on the margins already, that's not going to survive that process. So if we really want maximum diversity in our markets, these kinds of regulations like the eviction moratoria, like the minimum wage, it's important to try to avoid them. And again, it's not because the plight of the individuals who might be having difficulty paying their rent or having difficulty finding work is not on our mind. That's the foremost thing on the mind. The question is, which policy will most help those individuals be able to continue to stay afloat? And I think these kind of policies of control are misguided.
The third area I wanted to explore is one that should really hit home for someone who's recently received their PhD and who teaches. That's student loan forgiveness. The proposals are anywhere from $50,000 to President Biden has suggested a $10,000 one might be possible. So what do you think about the whole issue of forgiving student loan debt?
It's a complicated issue because the federal government has taken action in the past that has really driven up the price of higher education. So there's research that if you take a look at the maximum amount the federal government will allow individuals to take out in student loans, colleges immediately raise their tuition in order to meet that level to ensure that they are maximizing their own profit once students are able to mortgage that much. And of course, these are decisions that we're asking people who are 17, 18, 19 to make. You know, some of them aren't even really of legal age to enter a contract, yet they're taking out $100,000 in debt. So I do see the argument that if you've broken it, you have some responsibility to fix it. However, in practical terms, where we are today is that the people who have the most economic opportunity in American society are people who have completed a college education. It's people who have not been able to go to college or who have not even finished high school that have the most difficulty succeeding in the labor market. And so student loan forgiveness at this point does unfortunately represent a transfer from those who are less well off to the middle class. And it's the middle class is a powerful interest group. They are very vocal. They're active in voting. I understand why politicians want to try to appeal to them. But if your aim with policy is to try not to do harm to those who already struggle, I fear student loan forgiveness will wind up not being great. And again, contributing to this great burden of debt that we are continuing to keep afloat for now. But whenever the next really big economic collapse comes, that might not be able to remain true. So again, it's one of those policies that it would be so fantastic if it did help people, but I fear it doesn't.
As you've been in the classroom over the past year as a professor, how have you incorporated a real-time experience in economics like the pandemic into your teaching?
I haven't been teaching in traditional means. I haven't done the Zoom classes yet that so many of my colleagues have. But in the discussions that I do have with students, the pandemic is foremost on their mind. The Black Lives Matter protests of the summer are foremost on their mind, and they have a lot of questions about how tumultuous our society currently seems. So I think the political economy tradition that I work in and that I teach in, it asks these big picture questions about how it is that human societies can get along. How is it that we can succeed? What are the traps that we fall into? And as someone who studies history as well, I take a big picture view of these questions, and I know we've seen the kind of tumultuousness in the past that we're seeing today. I think as an educator, remaining open-minded and really trying to understand people's experiences the way they perceive them, it's the only way to do social science, and it's the only real way to have a conversation. So that's my goal in those conversations I have with students, is to try to really listen and to understand their concerns and their perspectives, because that's what society is. It's people's ideas and actions and the way they come together. So being able to observe such significant change in that real time, it's an incredible learning moment and an incredible opportunity to learn about the resilience and the struggles of the human spirit.
Would you explain the whole concept of the Mercatus Center, which is your home base at George Mason University? Sure.
The Mercatus Center is an independent research center. It's housed on the campus of George Mason University. As an independent research organization, we don't have partisan affiliations or particular research directives, but the research group I'm in is the Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And this is a research group that is focused on what we call mainline political economy. So the works in economics and in political science and in all social science disciplines that deal with these big questions of wealth and poverty and triumph and struggle. We work with multiple disciplines and with students across the country to try to address these and to try to do the best we can to capture some of the wisdom from centuries of social science in order to try to better understand the human condition.
Who was F.A. Hayek, after which your program is named?
F.A. Hayek is one of the most famous and most impactful economists of the 20th century. He is probably most famous for his work explaining the price system and the importance of prices to enable an economy to operate. So along with Ludwig von Mises, they were active as economists in the heyday of large-scale communist central planning. So in the time, they're responding in part to the beliefs of political organizations that they could completely replace and operate without a price system, without a system of market exchange at all. So the great insight that Hayek brings to this conversation is that prices capture the subjective values and wants and activities of individuals across the economy. And they are the only way we can really gather the information that is actually needed to coordinate economic activity. So they were incredibly persuasive in explaining why comprehensive central planning was doomed to failure. And even the Soviet Union indeed had to give up their true comprehensive plan after only about 5 years because of the incredible death toll it wrought. And they continued then for quite some period of time to work with other less comprehensive forms of planning until the Soviet Union eventually fell in 1989. But his work on that question, as well as his work on the nature of social science, what it means to be in a human society. He was one of these scholars that just could draw on almost any discipline, and he had that ability to understand. So those kind of people who can speak to us across disciplinary boundaries wind up having an outsized impact. And he's certainly had an impact on many disciplines, not just economics.
Where would you place your own economic philosophy on a political scale?
That's a good question. It's one I think about a lot. I consider myself primarily a market economist rather than necessarily having any particular political affiliation. But of course, my interest in market economics means that I have a great optimism in the ability of the market to bring about social progress and to bring about better lives for people. So that's why you hear me tending to be quite skeptical of top-down policy measures. I think activities from the bottom up, whether those are what we think of as being formally economic activity, or if that is more community organization and the kinds of cooperation that individuals engage in with each other in their neighborhoods and towns, that's more what I believe in. So I guess it's an individualist economic philosophy more so than mapping neatly onto any particular political ideology.
Who or what inspired you into the study of economics?
It was an interesting journey. I started out as a musician. I was studying music, classical piano as an undergraduate, and I took a class on comparative economic systems where I first encountered the work of Hayek. So his article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which is considered one of the top 10 articles ever written in economics. I read that as a junior in college and decided that this had so much to say about the human experience that I was willing to walk away from music and from the other more artistic pursuits that I had been engaged in earlier. So I still get really excited talking about these big picture questions and about how we can all figure out this strange experience of being human and of living together, which is extra difficult because we are human ourselves. So we have to try to think out of our own minds a little bit in order to really understand ourselves, which of course is impossible. So I think it's a never-ending journey, but one that was inspired by Hayek. And then I've encountered many other inspirations since I started down that road.
The musicians who are watching are going to wonder whether or not music is still a part of your life. Is it?
Yes, it's a greater part of my husband's life, but I still do play a little bit. He's a professional musician. That's been one of to tie back into the conversation we've been having about the pandemic, that's been one of the sad questions on a lot of people's minds, I think, is how are these individuals going to be impacted? Many musicians, of course, work especially when they're starting out, they work other service sector jobs, many of the jobs that have been most impacted. So I'm extremely excited to see a return to live music, hopefully soon. And this is one of the frustrations, I think, that comes out of some of the state lists of which types of businesses are going to be allowed to operate and which are not. And I think we're getting away from that now. But at least last year, it was kind of unclear, why is it exactly that you can't put on an outdoor musical performance, but you can serve an outdoor meal? Or, why can you have limited occupancy in a restaurant, but not in a music venue? So I wish the very best for the musical community, and I hope we get back to normalcy for their sake.
One of George Mason's most prominent economists was Dr. Walter Williams, who was also a syndicated columnist nationally, was a guest on our network from time to time. Here's a clip of him from our archives.
Which way are we Americans headed? Tiny steps at a time. Are we headed towards more personal liberty, or are we headed towards more government control over our lives? It would have to unambiguously be the latter. And so I don't see a trend in the other direction, that is headed towards more liberty and less government control over our lives. So the ultimate end to this process is totalitarianism.
When Dr. Williams passed away last December, you wrote a tribute column to him. What was his influence on you as an economist?
Many of his students did write tributes, which I think itself speaks to how great of an impact he had. I listened to that full hour that he did on Q&A earlier in the week, and he is truly one of the great economic communicators, an incredibly talented economist. And he brought that kind of enthusiasm to the classroom. I think it's due to him that you see so many economists coming out of George Mason University who are really passionate about addressing big picture social questions and about teaching. So not just about learning, but about sharing that knowledge with others and learning from others and learning from your students. When I look at his life story and his activism in civil rights and what he overcame and what he fought through to become an economist, and then the incredible success that he had, I think he really had something figured out.
So what is your substantive response to the clip? Do you see the ultimate end of government growth as totalitarianism, or are there checks on the system that would prevent that?
The system does have checks in it. There are moments where it's easy to feel optimistic and moments where it's difficult to feel optimistic. I share Walter's view that there does seem to be an increasing complacency around allowing others to dictate the terms of our lives to us. And this kind of economic liberty that he sees as eroding, it's something that so many groups in not just American history, but in the history of societies throughout the world, people have had to fight. They've fought desperately to be able to make those kinds of choices about where they're going to live, how they're going to interact with others, what they're going to do for a living, and in general, how they're going to engage in the world around them. Economic activity is such a big and often overlooked part of that. And I do have some fear that the increasing growth of the regulatory state and the increasing overall size of government is taking so many resources away from people. One way to think about it is the market has this incredible ability to adapt. It's this great engine for prosperity. And government investment and government regulation inevitably slow that down. The question is, how much extra weight can the market bear before it can no longer power forward? I don't think that we are there yet, but I think it's a big picture skepticism of how much we're willing to burden the market is somewhat missing. And I think that kind of ideological check of what do people find acceptable? How much are they willing to tolerate in terms of regulation and in terms of being told what to do? That's a kind of check just as much as the checks and balances of our political systems are. And I wonder if that's a check that's weakening.
For much of history, economics has been a male-dominated field. If one goes to the internet and searches influential female economists, you find all kinds of stories being written today by publications like Kiplinger and Forbes, other business publications, with a number of women being cited as being influential in the field. What's been happening? What's attracting more women to economics?
I think it's easy to forget how recently in history we've allowed women full admission to public spaces. So it's not been that long that women have been even enrolled in economics departments. So I think we're finally seeing some of those brilliant women get to the stages in their career where they're being recognized with honors like the Nobel Prize. We've had 2 female Nobel Prize winners in economics now. And so I think it's always difficult to get change in any academic discipline. Academia is designed to change very slowly. The way that new people are brought into the academic space and the way they are trained and allowed to advance, it's very much decisions made by your peers. So when you still have people making those decisions, that we're living in an era where women need to get their husband's permission to open a checking account, or women are expected to quit working when they marry. These are practices that were still common in the 1960s. So I think we're finally seeing the fruit of jettisoning those last vestiges of the denial of economic opportunity to women. We're finally seeing the fruit of allowing women free choice to decide what they want to study and what kind of work they want to do. And it's bringing just incredible product into the world. The intellectual insights of these women, their teaching, and also their economic contributions.
Well, spend a little bit of time building on that. So in what ways does the presence of women in this study change perspectives?
That's a great question. One, the first and most obvious, to me at least, is the fact that we're 50% of the population, a touch more. So if you take 50% of your minds and tell them that they are not allowed to engage in the process of contestation and of developing ideas, then you're leaving so much value on the table. That's true of economic activity as well. Economies that deny women the ability to work, the ability to earn for themselves, these economies are leaving 50% of their productive capacity on the table. There was a wonderful study by Christine Lagarde at the IMF, I think in around 2009, that looked at just how much economic productivity was being sacrificed around the globe by norms that kept women out of these spaces. I think there also is, in the culture we live in, and the way that gender does still seem to matter today, having female role models in the classroom does seem to have an impact on students and does seem to help female students feel more comfortable entering the discipline. And this is something that I was skeptical about when I started as a teacher. I thought, why should it matter who the teacher is, what their identity is? But I've just seen it play out so many times that there's a student who's only comfortable or most comfortable talking to the female professor. And I think that kind of guidance of seeing someone who has your background and who looks like you and seeing the fact that they can do it just makes it easier to believe that you can do it too. And so I think both of those effects have been critically important.
What do most of the students whom you've been teaching in recent years go on to do with their lives?
Many of them go on to become professors. I teach mostly, for the past few years, been teaching mostly in the master's program at George Mason University, master's program in economics. And so many of those students wind up going on to either run or work at educational organizations, or they do policy writing, or they go into research careers of their own. I have some students who have started working with me at the undergrad or master's level and then gone on to get their PhD, which is always incredibly exciting as an educator to have someone get that excited about your discipline.
Do you have a proudest moment or a student story you want to share?
I think my proudest student story, it's always dangerous to offer those kinds of tales just because you don't want to take any credit away from the student themselves. But I will proudly use this opportunity to offer congratulations to Jordan Lofthouse, who I've been working with since he was an undergraduate, and now he is completed his PhD at George Mason University, and he's now my colleague in the Hayek Program and doing just fantastic research on environmental policy and on policy impact on Native reservations in the American West. You're definitely going to see his work in the future.
You cited that 2 women have already won the Nobel Prize in economics. The first of those was Elinor Ostrom. We have a clip to show our audience to let people see what she sounds like.
When Garrett Hardin published his paper in Science in 1968 on the tragedy of the commons, I thought, gee, he has just made this up. As he talked about, Well, he talked about, imagine a pasture open to anyone. It wasn't, here's my data. Well, that became almost like a religion. And the presumption was that humans were helpless and that they had to have a government tell them how to do this and take over or make it privatize it. So, but an external authority had to come in and do it, as if the external authority had people in it who had different genes.
You've written a book about her. What should people know about her work and what her influence has been?
I just love her. She's so herself, isn't she, when you listen to her talk? But yes, I have a edited volume. My co-editor on this project is Vlad Tarko, coming out very soon. And what this book does is it explores the impact that Elinor Ostrom has had on pretty much every discipline across the social sciences. And coming out of this conversation about the ability of women to succeed in academia, her story is pretty incredible, and it demonstrates how much of an impact gender norms have. Because when she first tried to enter the economics program at UCLA, she was denied. And she always wanted to do political economy work anyway, so she entered the political science program. So she's formally a political scientist. But she was literally rejected from an economics PhD program and then goes on to be awarded the Nobel Prize. If that isn't an inspiring story, I just don't know what is. It broke up her first marriage, the fact that she wanted to go into this kind of professional work. She wound up developing a lifelong partnership with her husband, Vincent Ostrom, and they worked together from their different perspectives. She did a lot of applied and empirical work. He was more of an abstract political theorist, and they were animated by this question of figuring out how it is that people resolve problems and organize for themselves without recourse to top-down policy. So she spent so much time traveling the world and studying how it is that small communities and organizations were able to resolve collective action problems for yourself. So you hear her almost joking about it in that clip, but she was responding to this idea that came out of very formalistic economics and political science in the mid-20th century, that you had to choose either the market or the state. There's no in between. And that just doesn't reflect reality. There are so many different ways that people choose to organize themselves, that they take responsibility and work together to come up with policies, with rules, with practices that can resolve whatever problem they're facing. So she focused a lot on overfishing, on irrigation, on water management problems, a deeply engaged environmental activist. She also did a good deal of work on public safety. And she studied policing and the way it is that policing had become divorced from the needs of the community. And her work is so important right now because it illustrates the importance of true community engagement in solving the problems that we face together, and the ways that top-down policy, if not very cautiously implemented, can really just destroy the ability of people to work together and communicate together and come up with their own resolutions to those problems. So I think, she won the highest honors in economics, the highest honors in political science. She was a lifelong learner, is one thing I can't end without making sure I get that in there, because I find that so inspiring as well. Throughout her career, even after she was well established and had written some of her canonical books, she went off to study with new people to learn game theory and to learn how to use mapping technologies in her research. And she just never stopped learning. She remained curious. She continued to ask the really big, important social questions. So I would recommend her work to anybody and everybody who's really interested in understanding human society.
Is your book an academic book or popular?
It's an academic book, but it's targeted more towards kind of an undergraduate level. So I think everybody who's watching this program right now would be able to enjoy it.
Has a biography been written of her?
Vlad Tarko, my co-editor for this project, has actually written a really wonderful intellectual biography of Elinor Ostrom. If you have a shorter amount of, or if any given person has a shorter amount of time, they're interested in investing and they want a place to start, there's a really nice documentary on PBS that was put together by Barbara Allen that goes through Elinor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom's life and work together. I would definitely recommend that as well.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and I guess I want to sum all this up by thinking about the work that you and your colleagues do at the Mercatus School and the big policy debates that go on in Washington, D.C. What do you think is the influence and importance of market-based, sometimes libertarian thinking on Washington? Can you point to areas where it really has made a difference in where the policy decisions have ended up?
I think it has made a difference, and particularly in areas like occupational licensing and other regulatory reforms. We've had scholars who are more policy active kind of educate people who wish to work for improvement in those areas. I think in general, the way that both the Mercatus Center and any organization like ours or any political economist working in this tradition can contribute to policy is by creatively thinking about solutions. So what are the alternatives? If there's a social problem being faced, there are always many different ways to approach resolving the problem. Some of those might involve federal policy, some of them might involve state or local policy, some of them might involve community activism and organization. There might be things that we can do as individuals on the ground to make the situation better. So I think this kind of creative imagination of different policy alternatives and the impact that they will have on people is a really exciting project for anybody who wants to be involved in political economy. And I think that's certainly what Elinor Ostrom did. I think that's what Friedrich Hayek did. He helped us imagine the different ways that we connect as people and the ways that we structure our life together, even outside of formal politics. So yeah, I think that imagination, that suggestion, making proposals, that's what James Buchanan, the founder of Public Choice, said, that you propose an idea and then you see what the democratic process thinks about it. So that's what I think about what we do.
Economist Jayme Lemke of the Mercatus School at George Mason University, thank you so much for spending an hour with C-SPAN.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Q&A, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please take a minute to rate and review us. You can also send us an email about Q&A at podcasts@c-span.org. Send me your questions, your comments, or ideas. Your feedback is welcome.